These are the stories we share around the dinner table, tell in front of the campfire, and listen to on our porch. This is a place where tales are told and stories are heard. Grab your tea, your cocoa, your wild turkey whiskey, your wine. Welcome to Season 2 of the Storyteller's Porch, where we will be hearing tales of the farm with your host and storyteller, Jill Davis.
Welcome to the Storyteller's Porch. I'm your host, Jill Davis, and I am back on the porch today with my friend, Emily J. Smith. Emily, thanks for going along on this adventure with me.
It is. I hear we're about to have a serious adventure today.
This is where things change. This is the beginning of the changes. I just got back to the farm because I spend a lot of time out on this little farm that I have in Kansas. And whenever I'm there, it's like, sometimes I feel like it's 1942. Sometimes it feels like 1889. Sometimes it feels like 1962. But it never, ever feels like 2022, which is when we're recording. It just never does. And I get back to the city, which is only 3 hours away. And yet it feels like I've time traveled. It's the strangest thing.
I could totally see that. And especially like when you're churning butter, it's really hard to place yourself in history.
I do not have a butter churner, nor will I ever have a butter churner. One of the things we've done recently is plant a tree line out at the farm. And I had to carry water, only 10 feet. But I had to carry water because my hose did not reach quite far enough. And I thought, can you imagine? In my mind, I was just thinking about them hauling water before they had a well. And then they did have a well and they still had to haul water. It makes water feel even more precious to me when I'm out there. And that's why I am drinking fresh water on the porch today. And my guess is you have water with me as well.
All the time.
All the time. At the farm this time out there, I was at the museum, the Cheyenne County Museum, just a little plug for the Cheyenne County Museum of Cheyenne County, Kansas. It is one of the most fascinating museums I've ever been to. And I've been to a lot of museums simply because it's so detailed for such a small section of the world. They have filing cabinet after filing cabinet after filing cabinet of stories of different people in the area. And I was talking to the main person there. I don't know that she would call herself a curator, but whenever I have a really deep question, they call her in. And she and I were talking about her husband, who is in his 80s. He told the story about when he was a little tiny person. Before they had a well, they would have to haul the water in. And they would roll it uphill from the river because obviously they go down to the river. This is the Republic River in Cheyenne County, Kansas. They go down to the river, fill the barrel with water, and then roll it up the hill. And so if they were to say, I'm thirsty, they would get a teaspoon of water because the plants needed and the crops needed the majority of the water.
Wow.
And we talk so much in our history now, in our world now that it's 2022, about, stay hydrated. I'm always telling my grandkids, have you hydrated today? Are you hydrated enough? I live in Colorado where everybody's chronically dehydrated. Can you imagine being a small child getting a teaspoon of water to satisfy your thirst?
No. And especially when I think of Kansas and windy and open, I would need more water than I currently drink.
Yes. It makes me understand my dad was chronically dehydrated. That was something we fought him all the time. When we were caregiving for him, he'd have a cup of coffee in the morning, and that was all he would drink the entire day. Wow. And I'd be like, Daddy, just one little sip of water. Just come on, Dad. He's like, I had a cup of coffee this morning. And now hearing that story, I understand better why.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Dang.
Mm-hmm. And again, that goes back to stories are so important. Understanding that story of a teaspoon of water makes me understand why my dad felt like a whole cup of coffee was more than enough to be hydrated.
Right? How many teaspoons is that?
I have no idea. That's a math course. I don't know, but a lot more than a teaspoon. So that's why I brought my water today, is just in honor of all those prairie people, prairie farmers, prairie ranchers who didn't have access to water like we do now. One of the first things my great-grandfather did out at the farm was to build the well. and to put a pump on it. So they had water from the beginning, but they still had to haul the water from the pump out to wherever it needed to go. And today, that's what we're talking about. Not the windmill, but the barn. We spent the last several episodes in nostalgia. And nostalgia always comes with that sepia tinted photograph where there's a little warm glow to it, no matter how hard it was. We find a little warm glow. And we're going back a little bit in history, but not very far. This is about the barn out at the farm. And just to recap real quickly, in 1886-ish, my great-grandfather claimed his homestead. He proved it in 1892, 5 years after he went out there. He built the storm cellar that has G.A. Henry stamped in it with the number 1886. And we do have pictures of that, and it's still there. It's so cool. Then we go forward to the 40s and 50s when my dad got it. It went out of the family. And 1956-ish was the last time that a Davis or a Henry lived out at the farm in Kansas. So it sat there for a long time. And that's why it sometimes feels like going back in history, is because things have pretty much stayed the same until November 1st, 2018. And that is the day my father passed away. And it's such an interesting thing, Emily, how we are in the world. And I know my dad chose that day to pass away because growing up, November 1st was a big day in the Davis household because it was the beginning of the new fiscal year for my dad's company, El Paso Floor. And so it was a little stressful up until that day. But then we have all the P&Ls done and ready for taxes and all of that done. And November 1st began the new fiscal year. And he passed away at the beginning of the new fiscal year. When my dad passed away, I inherited the farm. And the farm, as we've talked about in past episodes, had this 5-year lease on it, which I will never understand. And I swear, do you ever see those memes where it says, if you could sit on this bench and ask any person from history one question, what would it be? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do. And I'm laughing that this is going to be your question.
This is my question. Dad, sit your rear end down and tell me, what the heck were you thinking when you put a 5-year lease on this farm? Now, the good part of that 5-year lease is I just put it in the back of my mind. Like, my dad passed away, my mom passed away, my daughter was graduating from high school. My life as I knew it had changed, even though I didn't know it had changed just yet. But I had a tenant in the farmhouse taking care of it's about 5 to 10 acres of land that the farm buildings are on. And then the other, I don't know, what is that? 310 acres were taken care of by a farmer and all of that stuff. So I was not worried about it. I know I had 5 years, which would have taken me to November of 2023 until I got a phone call. And that phone call came from the manager of the land. And he called me and said, that barn out there that your great-grandpa, now he didn't say it like this. He just said, hey, Jill, that barn's got to come down because it's going to impact the crops. But this is what I heard. Jill, that incredibly cool barn that your great-grandfather built, that your dad kind of treated as another member of his family, is falling apart. And now it's your responsibility to figure out what you're going to do with it because it's going to ruin the crops if something doesn't happen.
City girl question.
Yes.
How does a barn ruin crops?
The barn doesn't ruin crops, but if a barn breaks down and comes down unaided, it will fly off into the crops. And those pretty John Deere green tractors that we see running around are not just, it's an $80,000 tractor. It's a $250 or a $450 or a $650,000 piece of machinery.
Wow.
And we do not want old 1880s barnwood in it. Or the fact that it has a metal roof from about 50 years ago on it, that metal roof will pop off and fly out in there. And it's just dangerous for the farmer.
It's not going to fly in one piece. It's going to put a bunch of pieces all over the place and be a pain for years to come.
Mm-hmm. And the wind will pick it up. It'll blow it away. And that's the tip of the iceberg that I know. I'm sure there's more in depth to it that I don't understand. But he made it very clear to me that his crops were at risk and I needed to take care of this. And I really didn't want the responsibility of this farm in the first place. And now I'm being told I have to figure something out. And I need to do it in the next 3 to 6 months. So, although I am estranged from my siblings, I contacted one of my siblings and I said, what am I supposed to do? Did Dad tell you anything? Because he certainly didn't tell me anything. And they told me that Dad wanted me to preserve the barn at all costs. And they had contacted somebody who would repair it for me. And they gave me that person's number. So I called this farm repair person and he told me, we will come out to the barn and we will do our best to repair it. Our starting bid is $35,000 and we can't guarantee we can repair it.
Wow.
So I called my land manager and said, okay, I'm not spending $35,000 on something. Please remember, I have 2 children at the time in college.
Right.
And I'm paying for that college education or a good chunk of it. And so that was not going to happen, that I was going to donate $35,000 to this. And this is in the middle of the pandemic. And what am I supposed to do? So I called my land manager and he said, well, I've called the fire department. They'll come out and do a clean burn for you for a donation. And if we can work it out and all of this. And I'm like, sure, that'll be fine. Let me think about it. He said, and of course you can always dismantle it if you want to, Jill. It's yours to do with what you want to. We're going to go into July 4th of 2020. I am at a party with a friend of mine. And he and I are talking to a group of his friends because it's his friend's party. And as we're talking about this barn in Kansas that I've inherited, I mentioned to one of the women there where it's located. She goes, oh my gosh, I grew up just 20 miles from there.
Wow.
Now remember, this is a teeny tiny little town in the middle of nowhere, just over the Kansas-Colorado border. She grew up on the other side of the Kansas-Colorado border in Colorado. So we start talking about it. She's like, dang, I would love some of that barnwood. People want barnwood. And then there may or may not have been a few Bud Lights involved at this point.
I disavow anything that happens after Bud Light.
Exactly. And a few whiskey shots and maybe some other alcohol going on. And we don't always make our best decisions under the influence. I was not under the influence, but all of the men at the party were. And these are all men who come from the trades. So they're construction, they're plumbers, they're electricians, they're general contractors. And they said, hey, we'll take the barn down for you. That sounds like fun.
Sounds like fun.
And I'm like, I don't think it does. Okay.
How many Bud Lights will it take to keep you thinking that sounds like fun?
I will be happy to furnish as much Bud Light as it takes to make it fun. And so then I started making phone calls and I'm trying to find out how to get a permit to burn this barn down. What I found out is permits are not required. Just be safe and don't do it if there's a burn ban.
Okay, so we just need to pause here and I need to know the size of this barn because I roughly know that this is a large barn. But the fact that you can burn this thing down and nobody needs to know about it is kind of amazing.
I don't even know how to tell you how big it is because I'm not good with measurements. But I will tell you, when I stood next to the barn door, which is one half of the first story, and I'm 5'4", the barn door is about 10 feet, and that's about half of it. So 10, 20, probably 30 to 40 feet high.
Okay.
And about 40 feet square, like 40 feet this way, 40 feet that way. Yes. So 40 by 40 and then 30 feet high.
Wow. Okay.
Huge.
What's in it?
So that's what was interesting is there's nothing, very, very little in it. There's very little in it. And my guess is the tenants who were there went in and cleaned it out of their things because they knew I was coming to check it out. There were some old doors and some old windows, and we pulled all of those out. And that was about it.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, there was very little in there. My boyfriend and I, we went out there, we took a look at it, we examined it, and he's like, I don't think this is going to come down. No Bud Lights involved at this point. But they'd chosen a date, and one of the men in this group was very adamant that we could take it down. I guess they watched like a bazillion YouTube videos on how to take down a barn.
You gave them the adventure of a lifetime.
Well, that's what they always said is who actually gets to tear down a barn?
You guys.
Yeah. Yeah, you guys do. So over Labor Day weekend, they took their holiday weekend, came out to the barn and started dismantling the barn. We started out pretty easy and we're just like, okay, we'll take it down. Everybody's a little unsure of what to do because like, there's this great big barn. How do you take it down?
Yeah.
Eventually they ended up cutting down some of the main points. So the roof fell down and then they wrapped a chain around it, pulled it out. It was quite complicated.
Wow.
We ended up renting a skid loader from someone in the community because I started making phone calls, trying to find one. Nobody told me we needed big equipment to do this. So I'm like, oh, I have a shovel. This will work. We ended up digging a great big hole in the middle of the pasture next to the barn. And we put all of the barn wood or whatever we didn't keep, we took. Mm-hmm. So we dug this great big hole. We filled it up with a large majority of the barn wood and we burned it. And it was scary to me because it's Kansas. But somehow for those 3 days, there was zero wind.
Wow.
The wind did not blow at all. And we hooked a hose up to the pump that went to the well, and we kept it tended and we kept it down and we let the hose run all night on the fire. And by the next morning, so on the morning of the fourth day, the farmer said the barn is down and it was completely down. Now we did take 2 flatbed trucks full of barn wood to different homes in different places for art projects and that type of thing. But it was down and it was hard. And I cried and I cried and I cried and I cried. It was 5 degrees, but it felt like 190 degrees out there. And my brother was with me, and my older brother is 74. And he was the only one who ever lived at the farm. And he was there for 2 years. And I didn't realize the emotional impact of tearing this barn down. And so my brother kept coming to me and saying, you know, Jill, it just feels like you're burning Dad down. And I understand his pain. It hurt. It was hard for him. And it hurt me to hear him say that. So it's a very emotional weekend, so emotional. And I've never been able to thank the 10 or 12 people who were out there to make this happen. I do not think I can say thank you enough for what they did. And I find it interesting now that I've been out at the farm a little bit more that no one in the neighborhood came by to check on us. There were no permits pulled because you don't pull permits. Nobody came to check in on us. Nobody was concerned about it because they just knew that we were doing the right thing. And it changed the whole skyline. And the corn crop was only maybe 10 feet away from the barn. And we didn't damage one corn stalk in the barn. Yeah, they were very proud of that. So was I. And I have videos of this being done, and those will be on our Storytellers Porch Facebook page that show the burning of the barn. And Emily, it was dramatic and intense. And so much must have happened in that barn over those 130 years that that barn stood. And one of the things that happened, my father was a very religious man. His faith was very deep. His faith in a Christian God was very deep. I do believe things happen for a reason. I also think sometimes we as humans have to make meaning out of everything. It's how we understand the world. And at the end of the barn burning, in the corner of the foundation that still stands, 2 pieces of barnwood had fallen to form a cross. And so I have that cross at my house. Eventually, it will go out to the farm, out to the barn. And I have painted on it the Henry Davis Barn, 1890 to 2020. And I think it's just a really good reminder, though, of how life changes and how life stays the same. We don't have any stories of that barn going up. There is nothing in any history book. Even though I've gone through all the history records at the Cheyenne County Museum, there is nothing in any individual book that I have been able to find that talks about the building of this barn. My grandfather would have still been single when it was built. He married my great-grandma Josephine in 1894. So he would have still been just him building this barn. I believe a community would have come along and helped him build it, but there's no stories about it. We know there were dairy cows there when my dad was growing up. We know that the Moffats rented the barn from my grandmother and they had dairy cows in it. We know that the tenants of the farmhouse had goats in it for a while. But I wonder what other stories there are. There's so many history books out there about Kansas. I don't know if it's still required in every English class, but did you read John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath?
Absolutely.
It's one of the rites of passage. I can't drive down a road and see a turtle on it without thinking of the Grapes of Wrath and the Dust Bowl of Kansas. A lot of people have recently read the book by Kristen Hanna, The Four Winds.
I actually have read that. It wrecked me.
You were one of the people who recommended it to me.
Gnarly.
Why did it wreck you, Emily?
I thought it was interesting when you mentioned the Grapes of Wrath. I think of the Grapes of Wrath as a California book because out of the Dust Bowl of Kansas, they landed here, right? So it's funny. I don't even think of it as a Kansas book. I think of it as a California book. And to me, The Four Winds is basically an expansion of what life was like here for people who were, looking for work and food and somewhere to live. And I think it was just, it's one thing to know about it abstractly. It's another thing to have a very well-written book.
I could not actually get through the book.
Really? That's unlike you.
It's very rare for me not to be able to read a book. I have a feeling in 3 or 4 years, as it settles in a little bit with the farm in Kansas, I'll be able to read it. But I've been so immersed in my own family's history, I just couldn't. Who knows if maybe there's some history book out there somewhere that talks about the raising of the barn. I'm currently reading a book called Under a Full Moon, The Last Lynching in Kansas.
Ooh.
It's by Alice K. Hill. And it's about the last lynching in Northwest Kansas, in Cheyenne County, Kansas.
Wow.
And so there's so many books that have been written about this little tiny part of the United States and a very small part of the world. And so I wonder, how many of those stories that are based in truth reflect in some way the way the barn was built. I do believe it was a Scandinavian area. There were a lot of Swedish people in that area. My grandfather was Irish, top to bottom, but his good friend was Swedish. And so I know there was a barn raising of some sort. You could not build a barn of that enormous size without help. Because I make meaning out of everything, because we as humans do, my personal stories with a collective impact. What I want to leave us with today is that concept of community. The community that I had, and I get teary-eyed when I talk about this, the community that came out and helped me tear down that barn was not even my community. It was my friend's community. But they came and they helped and they supported, and they did it for a couple of cases of Bud Light, a little bit of whiskey, and dinner out at the local Mexican restaurant. And so community still exists. And I believe that when we have community, we have hope. So as you listen to this, and I know, Emily, you have community.
I do.
And having community makes all the difference, doesn't it?
It does. And it's interesting that community both built the barn and laid it to rest, for lack of a better word.
Oh, I love that. We're going to start talking about the burning of the barn as laying the barn to rest.
Yeah. It needs to have almost a human ending.
Yes, it does. It served very well. It was a wonderful place, I think, for a lot of people's lives. Raised cattle, raised goats, raised all sorts of things so that people could live. And so the barn was laid to rest through community. And so that marker feels even more real, that we're marking a place. And now the fun part about the barn, the foundation, that 130-year-old foundation, concrete foundation, still is there. And a gentleman uses the pasture land, the barn is on the pasture land, for his cows. And so the cows wander over the foundation on a regular basis during the time that the cows are out in the pasture. And it just feels fitting that it's still being traversed by cattle.
Do they lay down? Is it cool?
They don't lay down on it. How do I say this in a polite way?
That's great.
So there is a lot of leftover goat material in the barn foundation, because I don't think the goats were ever cleaned out from. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's kind of smelly. It's not as smelly now because it's all dried out, but the cows just kind of walk around it and climb over it and don't spend a lot of time on it. Now they do lay down around the foundation, but it doesn't provide shade. It's just there, and the cows are just near it. And I do have pictures of those really cute cows on the website and on the Facebook page. As a matter of fact, one of our porch pets this season, Emily, is a cow named Hazel. And she is a brown little calf who wandered through that foundation.
Aww.
So as we complete today's time on the porch, as always, I'm grateful to have you here with me. You help me to clarify and not have that language, which I still don't really speak farm. I kind of speak farm. Sometimes I think of myself as Oliver Wendell Holmes III in a girl suit. Because for those of you who are too young to remember Green Acres, he was a gentleman farmer. I am not even a gentleman farmer. I just like living out there and visiting on occasion. And it is the community that brings us hope. And hope and community are what get us through difficult times. So I wish for you, my listeners today, our listeners, that you find lots of community. And with that, all the hope that you need to get through the days that we're in. Here at the Storyteller's Porch, we believe we are the stories we share. Stories of the barn, stories of the city, your story. Keep living it and meet us next time here on the porch. And be sure to bring your favorite drink.
Bud Light. This is not an ad.
Yeah, I know. You could sponsor me if you wanted to.
To learn more about this season's storytellers and to catch past episodes of The Storyteller's Porch, visit us at thestorytellersporch.com. To make sure you hear every exciting episode with Jill this season, subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and wherever you hear your favorite shows. We'll see you next time here on the porch at the farm, where I'll be drinking iced coffee and occasionally some wild turkey whiskey. What drink will you bring?